Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Giulia D'Agnolo Vallan, and this is a Sag Harbor Cinema Conversation.
Joining us today is film writer John Powers, and he wrote the ultimate book on Wong Kar Wai, who is the subject of a retrospective in Everwilter Cinema. The book it was published in 2016 and is sold out everywhere, so you cannot find it. But thank God we have John, because he knows everything about Wong Kar Wai, and they work together on the book, which is a very rare thing because Wong Kar Wai doesn't like to be discussing his work. Good afternoon, John.
Hello, how are you?
So first question, as you say in your preface, and as Wong Kar Wai says himself during the book, he doesn't like to talk about his work. He doesn't like to answer questions. How did you find yourself writing a book about him, and how did you convince him?
Well, actually, I didn't convince him. What happened was that he had talked to a person with the publisher years ago about maybe doing an art book about him rather than a book about him. And at one point he thought he needed a bit of text, so he called me to ask me two things. One, should he work on the China show that the Met was doing? Because my boss at the time, Anna Wintour at Vogue, was in charge of it. And then he also said, by the way, do I have any ideas of who should write a book with him? And I actually suggested other people. And then when he wasn't interested, I then became like Dick Cheney, if you recall, who after his big vice presidential search chose himself. And that's what I did.
But you knew him well before, right?
I knew him well before. I had met him maybe 20 some years before. And I had stood out for him among other critics, weirdly, because I looked like what he said was the Gweilo, meaning the kind of white version of this Hong Kong filmmaker named Patrick Tam. And so he grabbed people and said, hey, it's the white Patrick Tam, it's the Gweilo Patrick Tam. And then at the next film festival, we were walking along and he recognized me because I looked like his friend. And we became friendly through that. Yeah.
Wong Kar Wai was born in Shanghai and grew up in Hong Kong. Can you explain to us how that duality of culture plays into his work?
Okay, I mean, and because there are lots of things that are going on here. He was born in Shanghai. His parents left to go to Hong Kong because of work when he was 5. His older brother and sister were left behind. When he went to Shanghai, Shanghainese culture is different from Hong Kong culture. So he left the place where he felt at home as a little boy to a place that Westerners would think is the same place, basically China. But Hong Kong was very different. And that gave him, I think, a sense of dislocation that is at work in a lot of his, it's at play in a lot of his work. You know, people are often kind of out of place and not feeling quite at home, and they're always moving around looking for something. And I think that's partly because the loss of the family and the connection back to Shanghai. At the same time, he was speaking a different language as a kid because Shanghainese and Cantonese are different. And I think that maybe closed him off a bit as a kid. And he spent an incredible amount of time with his mother all the way through his teenage years. They would go to the movies every single day. And so I think that coming from that different place affected him. And what I'm always struck by in dealing with him is how Chinese he seems. You know, there's a deep level of comfort he has with China that a lot of the Hong Kong people I know don't have. Whereas I think there's something rooted for him in that, even though he feels incredibly at home in Hong Kong and loves Hong Kong.
So it's more belongs more to a Mandarin culture rather than a Cantonese. Would you say?
Well, Shanghainese is even kind of separate from Mandarin because it's a different dialect, and the Shanghainese are thought to be these peculiar people. So they are they are thought to be showier. They are thought to be artier. They are thought to be more refined. They are thought to be slipperier, and so that culture is a very different kind of culture, and the most refined people in China were always the Shanghainese.
Which all those adjectives are perfect for Wong Kar Wai. More refined, more culture, even slippery. Yeah.
Even slippery. Yeah. No. Every single thing about it. Because in addition to being a great filmmaker, he's always been he basically was forced because of a failure of an early film to be in charge of making his own movies. And so therefore he had to become a businessman. And he became a very good businessman. I mean, I know people who have dealt with him saying he's a tough negotiator. You know, he's good at business as well as art.
To that point, it's very unusual. He owns all his films. He produces his film. He owns all his films. How that complicates being able to make them?
Well, I think it's interesting. You know, the first he made two before that happened, but the second one was such a huge flop, no one would hire him, and he had to start producing his own films, which is why he owns all of them. On the positive side, that makes him like one of the handful of people, of major people, kind of like Godard, who more or less has complete control over what he wants to do. And you know, part of what that means for him is he goes back and re-edits them sometimes, you know, because he just didn't like it because it's completely his. You know, so that complicates, but it also made it harder because he's always cobbling together money from everywhere and thinking too much about that, I think. And I think that wore on him, and that's part of the process of, he was known for being a very slow filmmaker, but I think part of it was he was often doing a lot of business at the same time as he was doing the filmmaking, because he was doing the producing as well as the directing. And that's a very busy thing to do. And I think that probably affected his work.
And prior to Restitution, Hong Kong had developed a flourishing and very powerful film industry. How would you describe the way Wong Kar Wai fits in that context?
Well, I think originally he fit in perfectly. You know, he was this bright young guy who was in Hong Kong TV. A lot of people got into film through TV, and he quickly got a reputation as being a great screenwriter. You know, I mean, and many years later, I was asking somebody, I was complaining about one of Wong Kar Wai's scripts, and I said he ought to get a better screenwriter. And they said the problem is he's the best screenwriter in Hong Kong. He just won't follow his script. But in fact, so he fit in. He could, you know, and his first film was a gangster film. That was the great day of gangster movies, and it was a huge hit. I mean, it actually took the things that people were doing and did it slightly differently. So it was a fresh gangster hit. But then he made the second one, which was a personal art film, and instantly he fell out of the mainstream of Hong Kong film culture, and nobody would hire him. You know, people at restaurants would come up and insult him for having made the film. It was such a disaster that people thought his career was ruined. You know, and so he then off in his own direction. But the funny thing was he then became the leading edge of what Hong Kong film could be. So he went from being the person who had fallen out of favor with all the money people in Hong Kong to being the person that somehow was like the trendsetter or a fast horse. I remember once in novel terms that Don DeLillo said that basically that Thomas Pynchon set the standard. You know, if you want to be considered a serious novelist now, he's the guy you have to beat. Okay, and I think with Wong Kar Wai, he became the person that all the young filmmakers thought it has to be as interesting and good as his. Otherwise, it's not interesting anymore.
And beside Patrick Tam, who was a big influence on him, which other of the great Hong Kong filmmakers have formed his work, if any, or which one of the Western filmmaker?
Oh, no, well, I mean, it's interesting. I think he's actually more influenced by Western things. And I think influenced by films we wouldn't know. I think he was influenced by a lot of the Cathay and Shaw crowd-pleasing mainstream films that we didn't see very many of in the West. I think he saw old Shanghainese films, but his mom loved Hollywood movies too. So that in fact, he grew up watching the big glossy romances with Robert Taylor. You know, his mom liked handsome actors, so they would go off and see that kind of film. And that's what he cut his teeth on. And then he went to art school. And you know, when you talk to him like about certain things, if you ask him about a certain shot, he will say, "Oh, I took that from Antonioni," or he's a great lover of Tennessee Williams. You know, a person who I wouldn't necessarily have thought he's a lover of Fassbinder. You know, that, you know, I mean, and you can see it sometimes in some of the production design, but you know, temperamentally he's quite different from Fassbinder. You know, it's you know, I mean, it's just at the basic level, Fassbinder I think broke the heart of probably every single person he ever worked with and treated them meanly. And Wong Kar Wai is known for treating everybody well and has been with the same people for 30 some years.
You mentioned before that he started as a screenwriter. Is it true that he writes the script as the production goes along? Because his films have this way of being, they're incredibly beautiful, and so he works. They're very worked on, but at the same time they project this complete sense of freedom.
Oh yeah, they do. No, I mean, I remember him telling me once that he thought he would be like Hitchcock and everything would be planned out. And on the first day of his first film, he slept late and realized he didn't know what he was shooting. But it is true is that almost every day he would write that day's shooting, and it would be partly based because he couldn't do it. I think he's one of those people who's deadline challenged and literally can't be creative until he's completely under the gun. But I think also what happens is he liked the freedom of every day responding to what he'd seen the day before. And sometimes that could be kind of crazy. So his films can go off in many different directions because he might just change his mind the morning after shooting something. Wouldn't it be interesting to go someplace else? And he would actually change the entire direction of the film. But because he wrote it every day, I mean, every day in the morning before shooting, he could do that. So it gives a lot of freedom. I mean, he's a very, in another way, he's a very bespoke screenwriter. So he doesn't write parts, he writes parts specifically for people, or actresses or actors. And he writes those parts specifically for them on the day they're going to say them. Which is almost nobody in the world does that, I suspect.
There is something that I hadn't thought of that you mentioned in your book, is that unlike most filmmakers, he seems fascinated in the same way both by men and women. Yes. And I hadn't thought of it. I mean, most filmmakers, they either have a more interest in men or in women, and he seems fascinated and compelled by both of them. Can you describe the relationship he has with his characters and with his actors?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, if I could just quickly start by saying, I think a lot of it must go back to the fact that his mother was so important in his life. That his father was a distant figure, so I think for him being with, and his mother was smarter than his father, and his mother was more cultured than his father. I mean, I think the family thought his mother had married down to be with the father. So he was with a cultured, intelligent, active woman growing up. So I think he was just interested in women from the beginning. Okay, then the movies she liked tended to be, a lot of them would have strong female characters, so there was that. But then I think also he likes romances. I mean, clearly almost every film he makes is a love story. And being a straight filmmaker, that means that most of his films are straight love stories between heterosexual couples, which requires women. And then he's interested in women. And in fact, he's very good. He's a very soothing, appealing presence who's very good at drawing things out. And I'm told, by people who work with him, he was very good at treating men and women equally on the set. That he didn't, someone like John Ford is going to pal around with his drinking buddies, and the women are going to feel kind of out of it. Whereas Wong, I think, was always very good at hanging out with and being with the women in his films. And when he talked about how he directed them, his way of talking about directing a female an actress as opposed to an actor was exactly the same. Every story he told me about how he did it, it was like, if he was going to teach Maggie Cheung how she's supposed to walk in a film, he would then tell you how he taught Tony Leung how to walk, or how to do a physical action in something else. I mean, he's very precise about that. And I think, that he also loves beauty. And I think that, a lot of male filmmakers, especially in the period where women weren't in the films a lot, didn't love beauty so much. Whereas, Wong likes female beauty. He likes glamour. And a lot of the things that are part of his films and that he loves are inseparable from having women in them. I mean, and as I said, then he treats the characters, he makes them complex. There are nasty women, and there are smart women, and there are dumb women, and there are cute women. There's a huge range of female characters, and they're always the equal, at least, of the men in the films.
In one of your conversation, he says that all female characters in his films are his wife, and Esther, who has been married to forever, and they met when they were teenagers.
Yes, no, I think that's true. I mean, I've been with them a lot, and she is a quiet but formidable presence, and so he thinks she's strong. They will bicker over whether or not she actually thought of particular parts of the films, which I think is kind of cute. But I think about him is that they have a very intense and private relationship. I mean, it's a hugely important relationship in his life. I mean, even at the level at which, a lot of people who've worked with him have never been with him to his house. I mean, people who've known him for 25 years have never been to his house because that's where he and Esther live, and that's theirs, and it's their separated off place. And I can only imagine what goes on there. But then in fact, I mean, there's something, I think I mentioned the paradox of his work is that almost all of his love stories are sad and end with people not getting together. And in his own life, he's been together, I think, longer than any filmmaker that I can think of. Maybe Hitchcock and Alma were together that's as long. But I mean, it's now what, 40 years more than 40 years they've been together, and he's just in his early 60s. I mean, they met as teenagers, fell in love, and have been together ever since.
You mentioned the word beauty before, and beauty it is immediately associated to Wong Kar Wai's work. And as you suggest in the book, there is not many filmmakers that have a vision of the world so distinct that you identify their movies very immediately and say, this is a David Lynch, this is an Antonioni, this is a Wes, and Wong Kar Wai is one of them. Still, compared to some of the filmmakers I mentioned, sometimes there are some critic circle that think that is only about surfaces, that beauty, and the surface of beauty is all he is about. And your book makes a really strong case for the opposite, that he's a very profound and substantial filmmaker. And I know you took an entire book to explain it, but can you encapsulate it for us? Why? Why is not a shallow, glamour obsessed filmmaker, but something much more complex and interesting and ambitious?
Oh, I mean, I think you'd have to probably go bit by bit or film by film. But what you would realize is that, yes, his films look great. They're filled with beautiful people. And the photography is beautiful in a way that sometimes looks like a commercial. But in fact, I think that probably in the 40s in Hollywood, if they'd had TV commercials, those TV commercials might have looked like Hollywood movies. So you start with the fact that they're beautiful in that kind of way, but then you realize that almost every film has an idea behind it and is about something. There's the surface romance, but if you take like the most delightful and shallow seeming of his films, which is Chungking Express, it's two stories, it's two love stories. People are dancing to California Dreaming, and the people are all cute. And at the same time, it's also quite deliberately a two-parted film. The two sides reflect each other. One side is set on the island, set on the Hong Kong island. The other side is set on Kowloon. One is daytime, one is nighttime. They offer parallel versions of Hong Kong at a particular point in its history. And that is felt as such by the people who are watching it, that the romances are all about people loving one another, or maybe thinking they love one another, yet they're often deflecting the way they love one another into love of objects or into fetishism of objects. So it's a very complicated, kind of almost, in some ways, kind of almost Nabokovian, I think, way he works up his world filled with echoes and so forth. So there's the basic emotions that you feel, but that almost every single shot has something that is reflecting or commenting on something out in the world. If you think, as I say, when you watch Chungking Express, you may not notice that, but then you realize that his next film, Fallen Angels, is a commentary on Chungking Express, that in fact it follows the same structure, but it's completely different. It's much darker. The characters are not likable, and essentially he's commenting on a different side of Hong Kong, on a different side of romance. And you can go all the way through his work. And Happy Together is a film about a gay romance, but it's also at some level an allegory about Hong Kong and China. And it's quite oblique, but it's there deliberately, starting with shots of passports and people leaving China. In the Mood for Love, I mean, a good friend of both Julia and mine, hates In the Mood for Love and thinks, and has compared it to a commercial. Yet, in fact, it's essentially a musical where the people don't sing. That to say that is shallow, when in fact it's clearly the style of the film is musical, and it was made into a ballet in Shanghai. It's a deliberate stylistic choice, and people are moved by it. I think the part that's often gets left out when people are critical of him being shallow is that his movies are quite moving. People get emotionally involved in them. I'm not moved when I watch a fashion commercial. I'm not moved by perfume ads. And yet people, and I don't go back to see them over and over. A film like In the Mood for Love, people love. They love being in that world, and it's the depth of feeling in that world that he evokes, even though it's quite beautiful and the music is playing and all the rest. So I think that the key thing to remember about him is that the style isn't something that he's slapped on in order to make it beautiful. I think it's partly his vision of the world, the way he feels things is the beauty of stuff. And I think he likes the beauty of people because he loves them. That he wants everyone to look great all the time. And even when he tries not to, he can't quite do it. Because he actually does also, truthfully, he's kind of just hooked on visual beauty for its own sake. But I think that's not uncommon. I think almost every filmmaker has the things they just like, and then they try to see what they can do with that and how they can deepen it. I think he does that. It's not up to me to say it. As I say, you can go through film by film and show the themes that are doing and how shot by shot he's how he's using lenses or how he's using people's position in the frames. He actually does do all that stuff. But I think the people who don't like him just think, oh, this is great looking stuff, it looks like a commercial, and write him off. I think that's foolish.
I want to encourage, I don't want to monopolize you, so please send your question in the chat that I have right here. But I have one more question for myself, and then I'll go to the others. He has he has very important. He has several collaborators that he works with on and on and on, but two in particular: William Chang, who is his production designer, his costume designer, and his editor, which is a really odd combination. And then Christopher Doyle, who shot several of his films. Can you describe a little bit the contribution that they bring to his work?
Yes. Well, Christopher Doyle is actually the easier of the two. Because he's kind of a wild man.
And being the director of photography, yeah.
He's director of photography, yes. Who simply gives the film a lot of film its look, in particular the look of something like Chungking Express, which was, I think, copied for the next 15 years by scads of people. That's him and his brilliance at grabbing things on the run. One of Christopher Doyle's great things is being able to use natural light. One of his great things is being able to make he knew what Wong Kar Wai wanted to look at. I remember that, and that's the kind of thing that filmmakers don't often get, or people don't often acknowledge, is that some DPs know what the filmmaker wants to look at and how they want to look at it. And Christopher Doyle and Wong saw eye to eye in this is how we want this actor to look here. And they wouldn't even have to say it. They would just actually know. William Chang, who is the production designer, Wong met him before he'd ever made films. He does the costumes, he does the hair and makeup. He does basically almost the entire look of the film started with William Chang, who is, I think, a genius. And I think Wong actually thinks I think Wong thinks he's such a genius that even though William Chang is even slower than Wong, and Wong is the most famous slow director around, that he couldn't not be with him, because a lot of that beauty that Wong Kar Wai loved comes from William Chang, and William Chang knows how he shoots, so he's able to build sets that work perfectly. Maybe not for every director, but he knows just from a kind of mind meld, how much of a set you have to build, because how much Wong Kar Wai would actually need and what he'd want. And as I say, I mean, he's an extraordinary talent. If you think, when you look at The Mood for Love, that every single outfit that Maggie Cheung wears in that was designed by the production designer and the costume and the hair person and the editor, all the same guy. He's with every single, the 30 cheongsam that she wears, and they're good enough. And for me, this is the key thing. They were good enough that when I was at Vogue, the fashion people said, could I write a piece on the fashion in that movie? Because the cheongsams were so beautiful. And he did that in all of the films. If you see a Hawaiian shirt someone's wearing, William Chang chose that shirt. All the things that reveal character all of this come with his contribution to the film. So he's completely essential.
I have a question from Heather. People say he has a mysterious style of production. It is really true that he doesn't give his actors scripts, or sometimes doesn't even have scripts when he starts shooting? If so, why does he work like this?
Okay. Well, this is true. I think often what will happen is he will have an idea in his head, and his reputation was such that the actors he wanted to work with trusted him. I would say that the interesting thing, if I can just quickly say this, he made a film called Days of Being Wild, which is his second film, which was a huge flop and that ruined him in Hong Kong. Yet the actors loved being in it, because they thought, oh, I'm finally getting to be with somebody who really cares about my acting, who's letting me play an interesting character. And so Wong's name has always been great with actors, because they want to do it. Now, why doesn't he write in advance? I think it's partly because he's incapable of writing in advance. If you're, I've been a journalist, and I've had friends who will tell me they can't start writing a film review until the official deadline hits, at which point they can then sit down and write it. Okay, so you're pointing to yourself. No, it's a very, and he's the film version of that. The big difference being, of course, is that film is an expensive medium. And so to have a person sitting writing while your entire cast and crew are hanging out in Buenos Aires is a strange thing to do. He always says he wishes he didn't do it that way, because the stress is so great. But I think he also thinks he gets something extra out of it. I think he thinks everything is more spontaneous and alive when everything is coming together at that moment, rather than being planned out.
He loves literature, and you've pointed out how big an influence Manuel Puig has been in his work, which I really didn't expect.
No, I wouldn't have expected. It was interesting when I went to his office for the first time. I was stunned by how long and full his bookshelves were. That usually when you go see filmmakers, you don't find wall after wall of books, and fiction in particular, that have clearly been read. He reads an incredible amount. Manuel Puig, he liked a lot of the Latin American writers. I think he liked the way they played with time, the way they played with narrative, the way they would leap. He liked that. And as I say, he then loves Tennessee Williams, I think, for the passion. There's a lot of Tennessee Williams in the film Days of Being Wild, which even has quotations from Tennessee Williams in it, that I hadn't caught the first time. And he explained, and Wong explained to me very, patiently, that I should have caught that because I'm a critic. Why should, and that I should know these things.
Question for Jay. The music choices and the scenes always seem made for each other. Can you talk about his use of music, especially popular songs? Does he have these songs in mind when he creates a scene, or does he find the song in the editing room?
Yes, I think usually he has a song in mind, and sometimes he would play the song while they're doing things to get people in the mood. I think, perhaps a few times he would add something, but in the film that people can watch, called As Tears Go By, there's a long thing to the song Take My Breath Away. And clearly the whole thing is designed around that song. He's one of those people who has a very good ear for pop songs. Mm-hmm. And to trace this back to his biography, if I may, is he lived on a street where there were lots of music stores, which back then would be like playing records, just outside the apartment where he lived. He said if you stepped outside, you would hear the music playing, and you would hear contemporary pop music, you'd hear Latin music, you'd hear Chinese music, you'd hear it all. And I think that kind of shaped his sense of like what the soundtrack of a world is like. I think his some people's worlds are quiet. Wong's world is almost always filled with music, but I think that's what he grew up with, and I think that's why it's there.
What are your favorite music choices of his?
Well, I mean, one of my favorite, I do like in Chungking Express the Dennis Brown reggae song called Things of Life and California Dreamin', just because the actress Faye Wong is so delightful when she dances to California Dreamin'. I think that the song he took from another film, for In the Mood for Love, it's called Umeji's song, and it's the central theme of the film. It plays over and over and over again, but in fact is a fantastic song. I think the soundtrack to the Nat King Cole songs, I like a whole lot in it. I mean, his music choices are usually surprisingly good. I mean, in that respect, I think, he reminds me a bit of Quentin Tarantino, who somehow uses songs very appropriately, and they're slightly off songs. They're never, of all the reggae songs you would play, you would never choose Things of Life by Dennis Brown. But in the context of Chungking Express, it's actually perfect. California Dream is in a way too obvious, but somehow it's such a sunny thing, and it's the sunny episode of Chungking Express, and so therefore it's perfect for that. And I think that was probably triggered for him because there was a restaurant named California, and he saw that, and then he got into his head. Almost everyone is good, I think. But I think probably the one that people will remember most and love most is the theme to In the Mood for Love, which I remember one of the big people at Cannes saying, to hear like 3 notes from that, you instantly or mentally are thrown into the world of that film in a way that there are very few songs that actually pull you into a film.
I have a question from Mark. You said that Wong Kar Wai was influenced by the Hollywood film he saw in his early life, but is he also an influence on Western filmmakers?
Is he interested in Western filmmakers?
Is he also an influence on Western filmmakers?
Oh yes, he is, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of them will just openly say it. Barry Jenkins, his If Beale Street Could Talk clearly is influenced by Wong Kar Wai, and he will say that. Sofia Coppola will just tell you that, especially that Lost in Translation was taken straight from the Wong Kar Wai playbook. I mean, for me, the most interesting case was I was talking to Matthew Weiner, who created Mad Men, and he was saying, and I said, he said, I was really influenced. I said, well, how were you influenced? He said, well, if you actually look at the opening shot where you first meet Don Draper in Mad Men, it's taken from a shot from In the Mood for Love. That they deliberately copied that shot because he liked it so much. And he just thought that was what a great way to introduce somebody. So I mean, but you could give, there's lots of less famous examples you could give along the way. I've always thought there's a Bertolucci film, the one with David Thewlis. I can't remember what it was called. It wasn't a very successful one. David Thewlis and Tandy Newton. They made a film together.
Yes. It's the one in Rome where he's in the house and she's downstairs.
Yes, in the house.
Yeah. I like that movie actually.
But it's shot and edited kind of like a Wong Kar Wai, because Bertolucci would think, oh, that's an interesting style to try to do. I mean, Bertolucci had plenty of style of his own, would still have that kind of chameleon quality, that he would think, oh, let's try to do that, and he might think, oh, the kids will like it, I'm not sure, I mean, commercials, alas, are filled with things that he does. I think his use of image to music has been copied by so many commercials now that it's actually hard, because almost anybody with a particularly strong style winds up having their stuff strip mined in so many ways. If I can get off Wong Kar Wai for a moment, I was recently talking to a lady friend of mine in London who had never seen The Godfather. And she finally saw The Godfather, and in the famous thing at the end where they intercut the baptism of the child with the killings of the people, yes, she thought, what a cliche. And that's because she'd seen it copied so many times that she had to remind herself that this was the thing everybody was copying. And I think that with a lot of the things you see that are kind of Wong Kar Wai-ish, when you see Wong Kar Wai, you think like, if it seems less original, I can assure you that back in 1994, people weren't using music and cutting to music the way he was doing it back then.
I have a question from Francis. When my friends don't know WKW, I say he makes nostalgic gangster, romance, food, art films. How does he describe his work? Would he say I have it all wrong?
Well, I think you've described a bunch of the things that are in his films. I mean, I think I don't think he doesn't like to describe them, and he doesn't really like to talk about the meaning of stuff, in that respect, weirdly, he reminds me a lot of David Lynch. There's some way, because I think there is something deeply private and deep in the psyche about Wong Kar Wai's movies. They're coming from someplace that as articulate as he is, he either can't or won't articulate. So he never will describe it to me. There'll be some basic idea. Oh, I wanted to make a movie that was kind of set back in Shanghai at that point, and that's, or not Shanghai, but in Hong Kong in the 60s. But how you actually get to the specific story, he will never do it. He will never talk about what it means. Every now and then, he if you ask him about a specific thing, why is this here? He might tell you, but he doesn't like to talk about meaning. So I think our listeners' characterization of it is actually pretty accurate. I mean, not all of them contain all of those elements. I mean, I think the nostalgia part is only part of it because most of the films are set in the present. Although what's interesting, he does have an interesting relationship to time. So that when he was talking about, for example, Chungking Express, it was partly for him that he was creating a time capsule of a Hong Kong that he thought wouldn't be existing much longer. In the same way that the film 2046 projects into the future, and also is the past of Hong Kong, is the future and past Hong Kong, and so you can tell that, but the future exists, I think, to cast light on the past, because he is steeped very much in the childhood Hong Kong when he was a Shanghainese boy. I mean, I think he more than most filmmakers, he's influenced by those early years of his life. I mean, he talked to me a lot about how basically the apartment building where he grew up was like Fellini's town that you see in Amarcord. That almost everything in it, from the characters you meet, either lived in the boarding house or in the apartment house they did, or dropped by, whether it's the gangsters would come by because they would know gangsters. The kung fu, from his kung fu movies, the kung fu stings were across the street. The ladies of the evening who were there stayed at their house sometimes, were lodgers. The mahjong games that went on all the time, his mom was having those. Almost so much of the texture of his world was personal to him. And I think that's one reason why, even when it's slickly shot, I think it's deeply felt. Because I think this is something he really knows. And he does it in such detail that there are things that never make it into the films that he was obsessive about. So for an example, for people who watch In the Mood for Love, they aren't just eating dumplings in the Mood for Love. They are eating particular seasonal dumplings. And the thing about it is, when you're watching it, if you're from the West, you will never know. Most people in Hong Kong wouldn't even know. But for him, he had a sense of what season this was, and this is the kind of dumpling they'd be eating, and those were the dumplings that they were trying to produce, rather than just ordinary dumplings. And there's that famous Nabokov story about talking about butterflies, where he talks about how butterflies camouflage themselves, but in fact, with their markings, they camouflage themselves even better than they need to. They would already be hidden by the tree, but in fact, their camouflage is even more elaborate and more precise and more detailed. And he always wanted his books to be that way. And I think Wong Kar Wai's films are that same kind of way, where you want everything to be so precise that people won't even notice some of the stuff that's there, because that's how it matters to you, because that's how you think it and feel it.
How would you describe your conversations? The book is, he has a long preface and then 6 conversations.
Yes.
How do you describe the process, and how did you decide the location, how long it took? It's a very interesting dynamic, just transpires from the page. And since we can't find the book anymore, just give us an idea how you work together.
Well, I learned very quickly that the filmmaker who was famous for always doing everything at the last minute while shooting was, if you were going to do a series of interviews with him, you would always do it at the last minute. So the first time I flew to Hong Kong to interview him, I was there 7 days. And we walked around and looked at stuff, but he wouldn't do the first interview until the night of the 7th day. So that we spent 6 days not doing interviews, even though I'd flown from Los Angeles to Hong Kong. So there's that aspect, because he just doesn't like to get to it until the last minute. So it's frustrating. Then but he tries to be helpful. Everybody who's done interviews knows some people want to help you and some people don't. And he actually, he wants to tell you stories. He wants to explain things. He worries a little bit that we did them in English, that his English wasn't good enough, but his English is plenty good. And what I would often do with him was, when he wouldn't want to say something, I would say something that I knew he would think was stupid, and he would correct me.
Give us an example.
Oh, what I would say is, isn't this particular shot here something of a meta shot, where you're making a commentary on the process of filming? And then he would say, no, and look at me incredulously and say, no, this just happened to be on that corner, and what I wanted was something else. And then he would tell you. Or I would say, I would offer some dumb theory in the film Days of Being Wild. There's a beautiful shot of palm trees played against a song by Los Indios Trabajadores. It's a very beautiful thing, and it's one of the most famous things in the film. So I would offer my theory of why he put it in, and then he would correct me by explaining, no, that's not how it happened. In fact, this is how it happened. Then he would tell me the story of how the shot was gotten, and the shot wasn't his idea. He hadn't thought of it in advance. There was no planning to do it. Christopher Doyle, the director of photography, they were in a train, and they'd finished shooting the scene they were shooting, and he had a little bit of extra film, which he thought he just wanted to use up. And they were driving by these palm trees, so he just put the camera out and did it. And then when people saw it, they all went, wow. And became one of the central things of the film. I kind of knew that, but I would offer a theory that I knew he would think was stupid or overthinking, because he always thinks critics overthink everything. So I would give him an overthinky something, and then he would explain to me either not the meaning, but how something came to be. And we did that a lot, in the course of the thing. And he's actually great company. He's a lot of fun. He likes to laugh. He likes to tease. He forced me to eat some very egregious food in Hong Kong, just to watch because I think he thought I was vain about how good I was about eating Chinese food, that he would then test me by giving me huge blocks of tofu, basically in a sea of pork blood, just to see how I'd react to it.
I have a question from John.
Yes.
Why does he always wear glasses? The sunglasses.
Oh, well, he's very complicated about this. I always think that part of it was to be cool, and he would never say that. But what he said, his explanation was that it allowed him. He feels that he doesn't think quite quickly enough, and it gives him an extra beat. There's a little bit of distance that's detached that lets him step back a little bit, and also he's partly in character as Wong Kar Wai. Because 95% of the time I was with him, he wasn't wearing sunglasses. He wasn't wearing sunglasses when he was doing the interview. But I think that there's the persona of the filmmaker that is different to the actual person. They overlap probably 85%, but somehow I think it's just, it's not as extreme as Paul Rubens in his Pee Wee Herman outfit. But I think somehow he feels on the job when he's got the sunglasses on. And I think he does, and I think also his eyes, you can't see his eyes, which then is a little bit of power. And I think that for a lot of people, they like that because I think even though they're being interviewed, they feel that they don't have the power because the other person is putting a camera in their face and shooting them. So they want to be able to control the eyes. I think it's a very elaborate thing. And I think also then what happened was because he's a master of branding, very early in his career, people saying, why is he always wearing sunglasses? Then you realize that his sunglasses are part of his fame. It's like it's Chaplin's bowler. As he would always say, Kurosawa wears sunglasses all the time. Think of all the shots of Godard when he's wearing sunglasses. And that's true. People do wear sunglasses. But for him, that was part of the image. And internationally, he was one of the first Chinese people to be cool. And I think I think internationally, sunglasses are an emblem of coolness. I think all of those went into it. It's a very long answer, but in fact, with a man as smart and complicated as he is, there would never be any one simple reason. And I think he couldn't even tease out all the reasons. But that's what I think.
I think that since you reveal his secret about the glasses, this is a good way to end this conversation. I could go on forever, but you gave us a lot of time, and thank you so much for having illuminated the films that can be seen on the virtual cinema. And thank you again, John. And I hope we'll have you in person when we manage to open the cinema.
Okay, no, I would love to be there, and people, I hope you enjoy the films. I think the one thing that I always say is, that of all these great filmmakers that you hear about, one of the things that I've always felt that made Wong Kar Wai different than a lot of them is that people really enjoy his films. There are so many great filmmakers who you admire and respect and you learn from and all that sort of stuff, and it's still not quite pleasure. And I think he never makes movies that aren't trying to be pleasurable for you. And so I think that this particular collection is filled with real treat movies. They're really enjoyable.
Yeah, they certainly are. Thank you again, John.
Okay, sure thing.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.